Skilled artisans resisted the new machines. These new machines were meant to be labor-saving, but instead they were costing people their jobs. Rioters started smashing the new machines and burning down the factories. They were known as Luddites because of a mythical figure named Ned Ludd. Ludd supposedly destroyed machines in the 1780s. These protests and riots, however, were met with repression. Luddites faced severe consequences. They were hanged or sent to penal colonies in Australia. Workers were forbidden to form labor unions in order to bargain for better pay and better working conditions.
Many working-class people found comfort in the new religious movement. In the mid-1700s, John Wesley founded the Methodist Church. He felt that people needed a personal sense of faith. He encouraged Christians to improve their conditions by adopting sober, moral ways. Methodist meetings included hymns and sermons promising forgiveness of sin and a better life to come. Preachers would take this message into the slums to the working-class people in hope of restoring hope and self-confidence. They had Sunday schools set up in order to study the Bible, as well as learning how to read and write. John Wesley was an incredibly smart man with lots of energy, who travelled all over the place, mainly on horseback. He was born in 1703 in Epworth, England, to parents Samuel and Susanna Wesley. He was the 15th child in the family. His dad became a rector in 1696, and when John Wesley was 5, he was rescued from the burning building of the rectory, which had a lasting impression on him, causing him to be more grateful and religious during his life.
Entrepreneurs that had set the Industrial Revolution in motion reaped the rewards. This new middle class was made up of several groups. Merchants, inventors, and skilled artisans were all part of this group. Their abilities propelled them to a better life. Some rose from rags to riches. Middle-class families lived in well-furnished houses. They dressed and ate well. They valued hard work and were determined to get ahead. They had very little sympathy for the poor and blamed their own misery on them, stating that the poor were so lazy and ignorant that they could not work their way up out of poverty. They placed a new emphasis on women acting more ladylike.
Middle-class women were encouraged to become more ladylike as a sign of their new standard of living. They did ladylike activities such as drawing, embroidery, or playing the piano. They did not work outside their homes and were discouraged from doing physical labor of housework. The first thing a family acquired with their new wealth was a maid to do the work for them. Daughters were educated to provide a happy, well-furnished home for their future husbands, and their sons were taught to become businessmen.
For the most part, England was a quiet and lovely land of farms and rural villages where only the sounds of weather, of animals, and the distant ringing of church bells broke the stillness of the landscape. Yet England was a land of great social inequality. A handful of aristocrats owned most of the land and possessed by right of birth nearly all of the incredible wealth it yielded. They built magnificent palaces for themselves and filled them with treasure, while an enormous lower class, most of whom owned no land, struggled to survive, often paying rent to the wealthy landowners. These poor people sometimes faced severe malnutrition and even starvation. They usually died young. With this as a background, let us find out what great changes were to occur as a result of industrialization. The first industrial revolution began in England for several reasons. First, she possessed rich deposits of iron and coal, resources essential to industrialization. Second, England had many reliable sources of water power. And third, numerous colonies around the world supplied her with abundant raw materials, like this cotton. And at the same time, they provided an enormous captive market for her manufactured goods, like this cloth. These colonial markets helped to stimulate the British textile and iron industries, and in the beginning, it was the wealth produced by these two industries that drove the Industrial Revolution. During the mid-18th century, the growing demand for goods such as the iron hand tools seen here resulted in greater competition among manufacturers. And as costs of production rose, manufacturers sought new ways of meeting the increased demand for their products without raising prices.
What is an overall summary of the hardships of the Industrial Revolution?
An overall summary of the hardships of the Industrial Revolution and their effects on society is this. Many people moved from small villages or towns to big cities due to an increase in the demand for workers, changes in farming meaning that less workers were needed, and a soaring population, leading to a lack of jobs in farm areas. Populations around coal or iron mines exploded almost overnight, and the populations in many urban areas rose exponentially. The new working class people lived under poverty in homes and slums with poor conditions. As well as this, they faced difficult working conditions, and often children and women were victims of abuse at the hands of fellow male workers or factory or mine owners. The factory became the focus of the Industrial Revolution, and factory workers often faced meager wages for their difficult job. They faced many dangers, such as machines without proper safety equipment, which often resulted in the deformation or loss of a limb, and in the case of some children, stunted growth. Women and children were the main workers in factories because they could be paid less than men for the same job.
They were also preferred in the mines because they were small, swift, and nimble. Children were often used because they were so easy to replace and only had to be paid minuscule wages in order to do the same job as men. Soon many machines were invented, which meant that employers didn't need as many workers, and they started to fire unnecessary workers. This caused the attacking and destroying of many factories and machines. Workers who rebelled like this were called Luddites, after an imaginary figure in England who was said to go about ransacking and destroying factory machines. Many working class people turned to religion to help them get by. The main religion in England at the time being Methodism. John Wesley caused a Methodist movement in England, often going to slums to preach to the less fortunate. People became devout Christians and began to do whatever the church said. There was new emphasis on ladylike behavior, and rich middle-class families often did no hard labor and had people to look after them.